In this video, we'll be exploring the new features available in Bitwig Studio 2.0. And so specifically what we'll be doing is seeing what's changed from version 1.3.15. So this is really a video aimed at people who are comfortable with version 1. As an FYI, I will be doing a lot of videos on new devices, and we'll kind of be looking at those in isolation and kind of, doing practical examples. But for now, I just wanted to do a little bit more of a generic overview and try to do it in, 15 or 20 minutes. So the first thing that's changed is that the icon has gone from red to yellow. So who knows, maybe blue will be next. And let's jump into the program. All right, so first things first is we have now this dashboard. So this dashboard has replaced your more generic settings. Now, there's not that much new stuff in here, but most of the things that have changed, especially with interface, has to do with making things more efficient for you. So you can see that when I highlight over the timeline here, it automatically jumps to the time tool. When I go over a clip, it automatically gives me the pointer tool. A lot of things like that have changed, and it might speed you up ever so slightly, which can make a big difference over time. But let's begin by opening up this dashboard. So this is now your settings. They call it the dashboard, and we have a bunch of different tabs. The first place we should go is to the help section, because here we have some really significant updates to the documentation, specifically the user guide. The user guide has gone from like 100 pages up to 300 pages. It's still very vague and generic, but at least more things are covered. And some of the topics that when I first got Bitwig and I read the user guide, I was like, I have no idea what this is saying. Those have been hammered out in a little bit more depth. If you're interested in the controller scripting, you can now also easily access that from here. Also worth mentioning that the website has added a lot more information about the devices than it had in the past. So you can use the website to get some information about things if you're a little bit confused. And let's say you don't want to have to sit and watch one of my full tutorial videos. You may not have to do that anymore. The documentation might suffice. Over here in online help, this is where Bitwig Studio can pretty much link to things that they want to show you. So for example, like I was saying, this is going to take you to the web page where they list specifically what's new with Bitwig Studio 2. They also have some official tutorials that they've put out. All of these things we will be looking at in this video vaguely to some extent. And then at the bottom, we have premium learning content. So whenever somebody puts out like an official course with Bitwig that they're charging for, I'm sure they'll probably update that here, and you can then click, go to that, and purchase that if that is something you are interested in doing. It's worth noting that many of the settings you're going to find inside of the dashboard you can also access from the interface itself. So this is all about efficiency, right? So with the display profile, in the past, we'd always have to go into the settings to change this, and we can still do that here like always. But now if I just come up to the top gray bar here, I can right click and I can do that from here. So this is just a speed thing. And you might be wondering, well, does this really make any difference? Once I set these once, I don't really need to set them again. There are some situations where this may come in handy. For example, let's say you're an instructor and you're teaching to a large class, you have your display up and you're working with the scaling all the way back like this. If you're talking about and trying to teach people compression and dynamics, and specifically the dynamics device, people are not going to be able to see this. And you, as an instructor, you know what you're doing with this. You don't need this to be any larger, but you'd love for this to be larger for your students. Is it going to make a lot of sense for you to go into the settings and start adjusting the scaling from here? Probably not. You maybe aren't going to do that. Instead, what you might do is right click and increase the scaling. We can see that it's totally responsive. And now this has gotten so much larger. And so anybody, even in the back of the room, is going to be able to see what's going on. So that's something that I think is quite useful. Maybe not so much for you as an everyday producer, but if you are an instructor, that can come in handy. As an everyday producer, one case where this might be useful is with the new analysis devices. So let's say that you're comparing your track to a commercially released track and you're looking at the spectrum. If you're way zoomed out, you're going to miss some of that detail. So zooming in is going to be useful for you. And I hope that at some point they allow you to pop out those analysis devices and scale them to your heart's content, make them full screen if you want, because for now, it's not that useful to have like a tiny little spectrum analyzer. I always like to have that much larger, but that's a personal thing. Back inside of the dashboard, we can see that an absolute mouse mode has been added. And I guess if you work on a tablet, you know whether or not you need this. I don't work with any tablets, so I have no idea. Anybody who does, feel free to write in the comments whether or not this has been a real help to you, and if it's been sort of a game changer for how you make your music. The behavior section is a place where some new things have been added. So now that we have this dashboard, we can adjust what happens when we open the program for the first time. Will the dashboard be open? And it will by default go to your recent projects, which is exactly how I want it to be. But you could also have a new blank project open. You could have a new project open with a template. You just select that in here. Or you could have the last project you've been working on open up right away. So if you are in the middle of like a mixing session, and then you go to bed and you're going to jump back into it the next morning, having the last project be the thing that opens up may be a good way to get you jumping right back into it. So there's no distraction. You get focused right away. Moving down here, we've added this automatically create fades section. And what we'll see later on is that the inspector has gotten rid of certain things. So if you remember before, we used to be able to create those little micro fades at the start and the end to reduce clicks. Well, that's not really in here anymore. But what you can do is automatically create fades on event splits. And so if you have something and you cut it, this will create fades to try to prevent those clicks from happening. So this is a good thing to have turned on for the most part. As we come down a little bit, this is the big one, and this is something that was not available before. In the past, anytime you bounce something, the bit depth was automatically going to be 24-bit. You can now change that to 16-bit or 32-bit floating point if you so choose. And this is just kind of the default setting. So within the program, like I was saying before, many of these things can be adjusted from in the program. Bouncing is one of those. So if I go in here and I select bounce, you can see that we can go in here and we can choose 16-bit or 32-bit. We also have a dither option that's only going to be useful if you actually are downsampling to 16-bit. So I wouldn't really select that at any other time. In fact, I probably would never select it. You really only want to dither once, and that would be on like a final export. We also have real-time bouncing. We'll get to that in just a second. That's very useful. Still in the settings tab, we now have an option for MIDI synchronization. We don't have time to really cover this, and what I would tell you is unless you're having problems, leave this alone. This is more for if you have like a lot of MIDI devices and they're communicating with one another and things are getting whacked out of sync. You can go in here and you can adjust this manually to try to bring them all together so that you're not having any serious latency problems. In the user section, we do have a location for demos. Right now, this isn't all that useful because I'm pretty sure all of these were available with version 1. So it's not as if any of these demo projects has really taken advantage of the new features in version 2. But I'm sure in the coming weeks, there will be things added here, and they'll probably be quite useful for you as a teaching aid and as a learning resource. I've already said it in this video, but so many of the updates are really what I call efficiency updates, and the customizable menus is one of these things. So what you're going to see is these menus, specifically what you get here on the far right, is going to change based on what you select in the program. So for example, now that I have the EQ5 selected, we have this device menu. And if I go in here, I can pin some of these things so that anytime I select a device, I'll get more features that I can just single click. So for example, being able to group things, all right, with one click might be useful. So now Now that I'm in the device section, if I select these two guys and I hit group, it's going to create an FX layer and it's going to group these together. Could I also just click Command G and use the key command? I could. This is really just a matter of how you like to work. But notice that when I go up here and I select audio 2, all right, that's now gone away. And now what I have is a track menu. Okay, and so I could choose things like rename, activate, deactivate. I can select group again. I could convert the track and so forth. And in this case, what's probably most useful is to have activate or deactivate pinned. So now if I come up here to this drum loop and I want to deactivate it, boom, I can deactivate it from there. Could I just go in here and click Option A? I could, but I now have the option to use my mouse and click at the same time. So it's definitely worth going through and clicking in different aspects of the program. So for example, here, if I click here, I get time, all right, and I get a lot of these selections. So having things like auto fade is actually going to be very useful to have. If I go and I click on this clip, you can see we now have a clip menu, and in this case I have auto fade pinned, and I also have consolidate pinned. I use consolidate all the time when I'm working with audio, so those are kind of useful to have up here in the top. And this is just going to be a matter of finding what works for you. But like I said before, you can also just go and I could right click on the clip and I get many of those same options. So if you're used to working in version 1.0 and you're used to working with key commands and you're used to right clicking, I should say, this isn't really that much of a major update, but for people coming in for the first time, they might really take advantage of that. Now, some of these menus, all right, they don't change at all. Like what's pinned is constant. So for example, here in the file menu, I have the option for things like new project, open, save, The only thing that I've pinned is the save command, because everything else I'm usually going to click file to do, and it's not going to be that much longer. I don't do it so frequently where I need to have it pinned. For me, what you pin are really frequent things. So for example, you could pin show dashboard, but you can also just go up here and click it. So there's really no advantage to pinning that as far as I can tell. Under the play setting here, there will be some things that you're going to want to pin if you want to set up all of the things you had access to in version 1. So for example, enable groove is something that you might want to pin. But what I noticed is when you put enable groove up here and you select it, you don't get the groove settings. So you're still going to have to go into the play section here to change your groove settings, at which point I was like, well, there's really no reason for me to pin this here. Automation right, that is definitely something that you are going to want to pin and be able to turn that on and off easily. By default, it is not pinned. So that is probably a big one for the arranger and then also for the clip launcher. So I have both of those pinned up here. So for things with the clip launcher, you can see they've put a little bit of a border around it. Okay, but these things are going to be up constantly. Same here with these add things. So for example, I could pin the add instrument track and add audio track. And so these are going to be up here at all times, and I could just very easily go and click those and bring in additional instrument tracks or audio tracks. Is this any faster than clicking Command T or Command Shift T? It's not really, but the option is available to you if you prefer to do it this way. Okay, and for the most part, what you're probably going to be doing is dragging and dropping anyway, and that's going to create new clips on their own. So again, just for the sake of things, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to unpin these because I want to keep this as simple as possible for myself. In the edit, we have some options like copying, cutting, and pasting. But for me, again, the easiest thing is just to have the undo and redo commands. If I want to delete a track, I'm just going to go in here and delete it and do so relatively quickly. So that's what's going on with the new customized menus. Definitely experiment further and see what other sort of menus pop up when you click on things. You can see we have both a clip event, we have a clip menu and also an event menu. And with the event menu, you do get some kind of cool things that might be worth bringing up. Again, I'd probably put the auto fades and the reset fades up here. because this is something I'm going to be clicking on and wanting to do all the time, and I no longer have that simple like on and off thing. So when I go in here and I want to do auto fades, I can go and I can just, I think that there's a simple key command for, I think it's just like F, it's Command F. So I can hit Command F and I can do it, and you can see those kind of pop up. But then if I want to reset those, I think I can hit Command Option F, or I could go and I could use these. Okay, so it's just a matter of how you want to do things. It's giving you as many options as possible. For me, I think what I've learned is that the key commands are going to probably be the way to go, but if you prefer going and clicking on things, you also have that option. One setting that I want to draw your attention to can only be found in the browser. And so when you highlight in this section over here, you'll see that when you right click, you have the option to include legacy devices. And these legacy devices are the mod devices from Bitwig Studio 1 that have been replaced by the modulator scheme. So there's things that you can load in that pretty much do the same thing. But if you're really used to working with the audio mod, as I actually am at this point, with the LFO mod and with the note mod, and you don't want to change that workflow and you're very used to doing it this way, you can still access those by including the legacy devices. A couple of very minor interface changes that may have already been adjusted in Bitwig Studio 1 is that your follow playback is now down here. And then your snap to settings have gone to a pop-up window. And this may be something that you want to adjust because by default it is just set to snap to grid, and the grid will be adjusting automatically. This is also now where you're going to find your straight versus triol versus quintal versus septal subdivisions when you want to have access to those. So you can't just change them from down here. You actually have to go in and select it from another sort of pop-up. The next thing is also very small, and it may just slightly change the way you work. In terms of practicality, nothing has really changed here. But when I go on to the clip view, I double click the clip, I have this brought up. I can now quickly jump between clip versus track. Track obviously following the timeline, clip isolating whatever is in this clip. And so the only thing that's a little bit different is that if you go in, you want to use automation, you can do clip-based automation, and with the clip-based automation, you get different settings, right? You get some of these guys here. Something has actually disappeared on me, which is a little odd. Let's see if we can bring that back. There we go. I'm not sure why that wasn't there before, but you are supposed to have these additional options if you want to go in free mode. And so if you had this just to be 5, but you had additional automation you wanted, you could do that. That's more relevant if you're using the clip launcher. But what you're going to notice is that in terms of like functionality, nothing's really changed. If I go in here and I'm just going to use regular, I don't really use the other options, and I create automation, you'll see that it's actually added that automation still to the timeline. And so if I duplicate this and I have my automation follows when clips are moved selected, you'll see that it moves it. But the thing I've never understood is when you're in clip mode, this automation should be tied to the clip. So when I delete these clips, the automation should go away, but it still doesn't. All right. And this is going to be true whether or not you're working in clip mode or track mode. If you have automation does not follow when clips are moved, it's not going to carry that automation over, which also doesn't make sense because this is tied to the clip supposedly. So this is a feature that still hasn't been updated. It's just that you can access this a little bit quicker. All right. And I guess one thing that would change, though, let's see if this is true. All right. And I'm not 100% sure how this is going to work. Let's see. All right. So I have this automation here, and I can look at it at the clip level. All right. If I duplicate these, oops, sorry, I need to have follow automation turned on. Let's see what happens if at the clip level I change something. Will it apply it to all of these? No, it does not. So it makes zero difference whether you're working at the track level or the clip level. So while that feature is there, I don't really see its use. I guess I haven't mentioned this yet, but you can now resize your audio tracks, and your instrument tracks. And this is really useful for your audio tracks more than anything else. If you're doing any sort of like editing and you're trying to look for a mistake, being able to zoom this in so far is going to make that a heck of a lot easier, increasing the display like so. But let's look at some of the other features that have changed, specifically now with the inspector. So if you're going to notice, the inspector has actually gotten a lot less inspecty. And now what we have are things like fade in, fade out, whereas before we had a lot of options for things like quantize, for reversing, for stretching options for 50 to 200%. And all of that stuff has now moved into either the clip or into the event. So to get to the event menu, I actually have to double click and then I get the event stuff here. So if I want to, for example, let's say go and double this out, double the content, or let's say scale it by 200%, you're going to notice that from the clip level, this doesn't really work all that well. So if I scale it, what it's really done is it's just created like a loop. And that's not really what I've wanted to have happen. So I'm going to undo that. Instead, what I need to do is I need to do this from the event level. So I go down to the event, I right click and I scale that out. Uh-oh, we're not seeing everything. And it's now creating that loop again. That's what it just did before. I need to go in and I need to consolidate this first, pull it out, and now go and I can drag the event the full way and I can get that to work. So it's a little bit cumbersome if you don't have a lot of experience working with it, but it's one of those things you get used to relatively quickly. Okay, so what's new in the actual inspector? Well, we now have the support for fades. But again, remember, it's very, very important not to get clips and events confused. Clips are simply containers. So this clip here is the equivalent of 14 bars. And I could put as many different events in here as possible. And you can think of events as just samples. So if I want to have a snare sound come in here after the pad, I could actually bring my snare in here and I could include it inside of the same clip. But if I was to go in here and create auto fades, and you're going to watch and see what happens here, when I get to the end of this event, it's probably still going to click. As you can hear, that click is occurring because the fade has been applied at the clip level, not at the event level. So I can go in here and I can, actually, I guess I have to right click to do this. I'm going to go and I'm going to reset the fades. All right, so it's then going to put those back out. When I go into the audio event, I can go and I can create my auto fades by hitting Command F. And now we're still getting a little bit of a click, but I can go and I can adjust the length from here. And that certainly helped that out a bit. So now if we were to loop this, obviously it's going to, not have any clicking or popping. So this is sort of the equivalent to what we had before, where we could create those micro fades on our own. Only now you have to be really careful about where you're finding it and realize that you have to kind of set that up manually, and in some cases set the length up manually. All right, cool. All right, let's actually talk about these fades a little more depth. So this is something that you can really figure out on your own. You can either add the fades, manually from here. This is setting the duration. So if I have the proper clip selected, I can go in here and I can add a fade like so. I can also just go and I can draw in that fade if I choose to do so, and then I can change the slope. And if I want an S-shaped curve, I have access to the S-shaped curve here. So depending on what you need, all of that has been made available to you. The other thing we have are the crossfades. So we can hear what happens when we go from one clip to the next. Right, not only are we getting the click, but we also are just jumping from one to the other. We'd rather kind of crossfade between the two. So to set up this crossfade, I'm just going to click and I'm going to drag over. And now we can listen. And now we've created that crossfade like so. Obviously, this is doing some fairly aggressive stretching to this thing. So let's actually just change that down and now listen to it. Oh, we're gonna click in there. Right, so crossfades have been added depending on, you know, when and where you need to use them. You can figure that out pretty much on your own, I think, for the most part. Another small thing that has been added that I know a lot of people requested is the ability to, when you're working with the pen tool on a MIDI clip, to be able to delete notes by using a right click. And so that is now something that has been added in. And so if you are used to working with pen tools in other digital audio workstations, this is going to speed you up considerably. I don't really use the pen tool all that often, so for me it's not going to make a difference, but for some people this could make all the difference in the world. It's also worth noting that I can actually use different tools depending on where I am. So if I click up here, I could go to tool number like 4, the eraser tool, and then when I click down here, I could be using the pen tool. So these do not have to be the same. And again, you just have to use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to go through them. But what I wanted to show you is just that I can create notes here. And then if I want to delete any of these with the pen tool selected, I can just right click and they'll go away. You'll actually see that it temporarily goes to the pointer tool and then it's going to get rid of those like so. All right, so that's something that's been added. Very small and not like a major update, but for some people, this could speed them up a really large amount. To some extent, VST3 support has been added. I wanted to use the free Bob Perry gate, which does not have a VST2 version. It only has a VST3, and that wouldn't work. And maybe that has to do with needing like a sidechain signal, but you know, it would crash every single time. But as far as I know, the roll and plug out system, those VST3s will work. And I think that's what people really wanted to have support for. So if you have that system, you can load those in and they should work no problem. What I've done is I've just created a separate folder and I've put a VST3 and a VST2 together, and I love to sort my plugins this way. I don't just keep them all in the default location. It just kind of gets too cluttered for me. So I like to sort of have like a favorites folder and then sort it out by category. But you can see that VST3, which is indicated by this little like blue tiny little square, as compared to VST2, which is the normal like orange little square, they can coexist in the same folder. And as you can see, I can load up this VST3 plugin and hopefully it should work. Let's actually play in the right location. So we can hear that that's working like so. All right, nothing too fancy. I would say right now, if you have the option between VST3 and VST2, go with the VST2 until VST3 gets a little bit more stable, which I'm sure it will do in the coming months. One thing you probably noticed in the upper right-hand corner when I opened up that plugin was a little notification tab that was showing me that the plugin was loading. So I can show it again if I grab this plugin and I bring it on. You can see we get that little loading plugin. So that dot up there is symbolizing notifications. So it will give you notifications for a variety of things. For example, if somebody sends you a project and there are missing samples or missing plugins, you can quickly navigate just from one click over to the project setting, missing files, missing plugins, and try to remedy that situation. When you're bouncing audio, it will give you a progress bar. When you load plugins, it gives you a progress bar. And I'm sure that when there's like new updates to the program, that will pop up there. But for me personally, the notifications are just kind of annoying. I know the plugin is loading, so I don't really need those. You can click it and you can get rid of it here. So now when I bring in the reverb plugin, it's just going to have like a blue pulsating dot showing me that it's loading. It turns to white. Boom. We have our plugin like so. Now let's see really quick if I bounce this. Is it going to give me that notification or is it going to leave it off? You can see that it's actually left it off there. And I think at some point they're going to allow you to customize what notifications you do and do not receive. Like, for example, I'd like to know when there's a new version of the program available, but I don't necessarily want it popping up when I load in plugins. I think that's on the horizon. I read somewhere that it's available now, but I can't figure out how to do it. So for now, it's either on or off, and that's going to be a decision that, you personally make depending on how you work. Speaking of bouncing, you can see that we now have a dialog box with a few more options, including the ability to choose what bit depth we want. Typically, you're going to be sticking with 24-bit, but then you also have the option for real time. And so what's the significance of real-time bouncing? Well, you're going to hear what happens. When I select real-time, it's actually going to go through the clip in actual time, and you're going to even hear the audio playing back. So if I have real-time turned on, I click OK. It goes ahead and it does that. As compared to when that's off, it's going to go a little bit quicker and you don't hear anything. So what are the trade-offs? Well, there are some plugins, for example, something like Nebula and specifically the dynamics processors, where it will struggle with kind of latency. And when you're doing an offline bounce and it's not in real time, a lot of times at the beginning of the clip, something can be thrown out of whack, or even just latency issues are introduced, like there's a subtle delay that gets brought in, and it can kind of be a pain. If you have plugins like UAD plugins, they're going to encourage you to do real-time bouncing. All right, if you have the Virus TI 1 or 2, you're going to want to use real-time bouncing for that, because if you don't, latency issues get brought into play, and sometimes the recording even gets screwed up. And so I know in the past, when I've worked with Nebula, I've had to basically start my pick a track myself and record onto that track and start it early to make sure that I don't have any problems. So it's like an override manual real-time bounce. Well, now that's made available to you from the settings, so we can hear the real-time bounce. And we can compare that to if we go and we bounce this and we do it not in real time. So let's rename this to real time, just so we know. And now we'll go and we're going to bounce this, not real time, but everything else has remained the same. You can see how much quicker that did it. Call this offline. All right, and now we can listen to the differences here. All right, this is the real time. The offline. Really listen to the transients. You can usually get a little bit sharper transient hits, I've noticed, when you do a real-time bounce. So like all compression or anything where you're exporting, the real time takes a lot longer, but then the quality is usually slightly better. But I would say only with particular plugins do you really want to go real time. If you're working on something professionally, you may want to do real-time bounce each and every time to ensure the highest quality. But again, it's up to you, and depending on the plugins that you're using, if you ever notice problems with bouncing and it's offline, definitely the first thing you should do is turn real-time bouncing on and see if that solves the problem.